Hey y'all, welcome back to our series on common mistakes authors make when pitching podcasts and how to fix or avoid them. This is Book Marketing Mania, and I'm your host, Kim Stewart. And last week, we talked about how we can avoid the common podcast pitching mistake of confusing the podcast host with your online presence or lack thereof, and how to fix it by updating your website and socials. And so now let's talk about common podcast pitching mistake number 7, not sharing your speaking experience in your pitch. And I'll share how to avoid that common mistake when pitching podcasts. So let's get to it. So first, y'all, I know some of you may be saying, well, I don't have any speaking experience the host can check out. Maybe you haven't guested on a podcast yet, but are you hosting your own show? Have you spoken in person before and have a link to the video on your website? Are you speaking on video on social media that you can link to? And have you been interviewed on the radio before by chance? Because what I'm hearing when I strategize with authors who have been pitching themselves with no success is a lot of them have been pitching Christian podcasts where both the host and the guest have lots of speaking experience. And if you don't have any speaking experience yourself for the host to check out, you're probably going to hear the responses back from your pitch like we talked about in episode 55. Now, I'm not saying pitching without any speaking experience won't work because 1, everyone has to start somewhere, right? And 2, you may have an incredibly timely message that hosts want to hear. Or 3, you may have a relationship with a host already and they likely would welcome you as a guest. And as a first-time guest, the host sometimes will want to schedule a pre-recording call with you to talk through your topic and questions they'll be asking and see how your audio sounds. And there's nothing wrong with that because it's just one more chance to build a relationship with the host so you can serve their listeners well. But having a little speaking experience under your belt will go a long way in your prospective podcast host mind. And again, that could be past podcast guest interviews, hosting your own podcast, videos on your social media, videos on your website, etc. So to fix the common mistake of podcast pitching without speaking experience is 1, gain some experience, and 2, if you do have experience, be sure to link to it in your email pitch so the host can see it right away. So let's talk about number 1, gaining speaking experience. Obviously, my favorite way is to guest on podcasts. And if you're just starting out guesting on podcasts and you want to connect with Christian podcasters, my favorite place to connect with hosts is the Christian Podcast Guest Facebook group and also the Spark Media Facebook group for Christian podcasters. And if you have speaking topics more for the general public, there's also a podcast guest collaboration Facebook group. And I will put links to all those. Actually, I'm going to put a link to the previous episode where we talked through those to learn about those groups and other ways you can find shows to pitch. And that's episode 33, and I will link to it in the show notes. Then another way you could gain speaking experience is to host your own podcast. That gives you a weekly opportunity to get better and better and practice using your voice behind a microphone. And if you want to learn more about that, you can tune in to episode 9 with my guest, Misty Phillip, and she is the host of the By His Grace podcast and founder of the Spark Network. And I will put a link to that in the show notes as well. Then thirdly, you could post social videos or ask a friend to do a live video with you on social. It could be more like an interview style if you want. And you can learn more about social videos for Instagram with episode number 4. My guest was Ruthie Gray. Or if you want to learn about LinkedIn, tune into episode 41 with my guest, Heather Hyman. And both of those will give you some great ideas for posting social videos. And then let's talk secondly about mentioning your speaking experience in your pitch. So if you're a podcast host, be sure to mention that up front and link to your show, because I will tell you that will send you to the front of the line in a lot of cases for guesting, because the hosts know that you have the equipment, you have a good microphone, you have headphones, you know how to record an episode, you're going to show up prepared no matter what. And it's super easy for them to then check out your show and hear your speaking experience. And also, as a host, there might be an opportunity for a guest swap if you have guests on your show as well. And that's a whole different conversation for another day of how you can be really strategic about that. But every podcast host that is looking to grow their own show is looking to guest on other shows. So if they see you're a podcast host that's pitching them, then they might reach back out to you and say, hey, how about a podcast swap? And stay tuned because I definitely have some episodes coming up on how guesting on podcast helps you grow your own show and how to be proactive with those podcast swaps. So be sure and follow the episode here in your podcast player so you don't miss an opportunity to hear that. Now, if you do have podcast guesting experience, you can create a Spotify playlist of episodes and link to it in your pitch. I love when podcast hosts reply to my pitch to ask about the playlist and how I created it. And I'll share the super easy instructions. And it also shows me that they took the time to get to the end of my email because that's where I place it. And it gives me an opportunity to go back and forth with the host and help them out to do something super easy, right? So you can even be more strategic in your email and mention a specific show that perhaps the host you're pitching has been a guest on it too. Or perhaps the show you guested on, that host has been a guest on your prospective host show. Does that make sense? So you were a guest on one podcast. That host happened to be a guest on the show that you're pitching. And so you want to make that connection. Make it easy for the host to connect the dots in similar relationships and be able to click on a past guest episode and hear your speaking experience, especially when it coincides with somebody else they know. So before you send your next podcast pitch, take a moment to fix or avoid the common mistake of pitching without speaking experience and provide some easy links for hosts to check you out and hear you speaking so they can decide quickly that you indeed are the next best guest they need on their show. And if you're ready to get started, grab my free video training on 5 steps to jumpstart your podcast pitching. I'll link it here in your player, or you can head to bookmarketingmania.com to sign up. And if you need some one-on-one help with your podcast pitching plan, I'd love to work with you. You can book a call with me at bookmarketingmania.com, and I'll also link it here in your player. And then next week, we'll tackle our next to last common podcast pitching mistake, number 8, pitching only when you launch. Oh, Lordy, y'all. Oh, I might should have made that number 1. I can't wait to help you fix it. And I'll see you next week.